All righty, so we're gonna like move forward expeditiously here. Next week, we're gonna look at the book of Job. Story about a good man who suffers a calamitous downfall for reasons that are somewhat mysterious. Today, we're going to look at two things, and I think we're asking a lot to get through it all, but we really need to, especially for the midterm. So we're going to start out by looking at Milton's depiction of the temptation with the serpent, and particularly his use of rhetoric. Rhetoric, we have very different, not a very different, but we have a derivative meaning of the word rhetoric today. Rhetoric in the ancient world, it's a Greek word coming, it is the art of public speaking. A rhetor, which is the root of the word, was just an orator, right? And that's, the word oration or orator is a public speaker. And rhetoric is not just the art of public speaking, but the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is a type of speech with a very specific purpose. You want to bring your audience around to the point of view you want them to have. So you use your words and structure your language and create your argument and use your evidence in a way to convince them of what you want them to believe. Rhetoric can be about the truth. It can be about trying to convince people of the truth, but it can also be about using other techniques to get them something you want them to believe, whether it's true or not, right? So it's not bound by the truth, but it can be, depending on who uses it and how they use it. And the serpent's speech is really a quite excellent example. Remember, he's the subtle serpent, the cunning, sneaky, clever serpent who beguiles Eve. He uses his language to mesmerize her, and you could say seduce her, but the seduction is not exactly sexual, although there's some interesting takes on that kind of stuff. But the seduction is psychological. It is there's a rational and an emotional element to this seduction. It's quite interesting. Then we're going to look at Prometheus, a Greek myth that has some, so the biblical tradition comes out of ancient Mesopotamia, and then Greek myth comes along in around the 8th century BC. Stories from ancient Greece start to emerge that are religious stories, and they form the basis of Greek religion and their understanding of the gods and whatnot. And Prometheus brings fire to mankind, and the fire has some obvious parallels with the fruit of the temptation. So I just want to, what did I do with it? Oh, here it is. Yeah. So I want to just kind of set up this comparison right now in a very basic way. And just contrast for a moment the meaning of the fruit versus the meaning of the fire. I think we don't have to say, I'm not going to ask anyone, what is the meaning of both of these symbols, right? Because obviously they're more than just physical objects. They are really symbols or figures of speech that really refer to something else, right? The fruit represents some type of knowledge. The fire also represents another type of knowledge. And these two stories make some interesting claims about what is most important for humankind and its happiness, right? I'll stop right there. So what kind of knowledge does the fruit represent?
The good and evil.
Yeah, and what kind of knowledge is that? So absolutely, and that's a good place to start, because the tree is literally named the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What kind of knowledge is knowledge of good and evil?
Is it more spiritual?
It could be considered that, but I don't deny that, but I think it falls under a more straightforward category that may be related to the spiritual.
Wisdom.
Yeah, wisdom. What is wisdom? What were you going to say, Angelica? What kind of knowledge is wisdom?
I was gonna say it's like pretty straightforward, like like you have you know how to think, like you have your own perception and decision, that you
Okay.
can think for yourself.
Yeah, so so wisdom is important too, because the Bible clearly indicates that knowledge of good and evil, having that knowledge is equal to wisdom. It says that when Adam and Eve picked the fruit of this tree, knowledge, they become wise. So there, the fruit represents wisdom. So wisdom is a funny kind of knowledge because it doesn't represent like a bunch of facts that you've learned by rote, right? By rote meaning like in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration. In 1787, the Constitution was written, blah, blah, blah. Those are kind of facts you learn by rote. And once you learn them, you download them into your head, and someone asks you, when was the Constitution written? You just repeat 1787, just like that. But wisdom is not that kind of knowledge. It's a synonym for wisdom is prudence. Prudence. And prudence and wisdom are a form of good judgment based on one's own experiences and the reflections and learning that one has gained from one's own experience. In the Leviathan, a book by Thomas Hobbes, a famous 17th century philosopher, he said, prudence, aka wisdom, is but experience. Wisdom is but experience. What is he saying? Someone with a lot of experience of life is wise. Question, is that true? Is it true that because you have a lot of experience in life, you are therefore a wise person?
I guess it depends on your experience.
Okay,
Like-
number one, it depends on experience. Good. What else does it depend on? So you're saying not quite. Is that your
Yeah,
answer, Angelica? Not quite.
Yeah,
Good.
not quite.
Yeah, not quite. It depends on your experience and also depends on what?
I think sometimes how you use that experience.
Yeah, let's put it a slightly different way. It depends on what you've actually learned from your own experiences. Some people go through all kinds of experiences and they never learn, right? Which is to say, you could say they keep repeating the same mistake over and over again, right? They encounter a situation, they do the wrong thing, they don't learn their lesson, they get to a similar situation and they do the same wrong thing, right? So you would say prudence is but experience when someone actually learns from their experiences, right? Let's come back to wisdom for a second. It's a specific type of judgment. It's judgment in dealing with matters of right and wrong. What type of knowledge is the fruit? What is the domain of, thought that deals with issues of right and wrong? What do we call that domain? You all know this. Matters that have to do with right and wrong, or what kind of matters?
Ethical.
Yeah, ethical or the word moral. And we don't need to get into the fine grained distinction between those two because there's a little difference, but it doesn't matter for our point of view. It's a technical distinction that isn't necessary anyway. So matters of right and wrong are moral issues, right? We as human beings with language, Aristotle says, we don't just live a life guided by pleasure and pain and stimuli responses to pleasure and pain. We live a life guided by coding experiences as either good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, and so on and so forth. So we live by definition a moral existence. And here I'm using the word moral in like the broadest understanding of it, right? When you typically think of a moral existence, you think of living the right kind of existence. But when I say moral, I just mean that we everybody, whether they do the right thing or the wrong thing, lives within the framework of a moral existence, even when they're not living, morally in a righteous way, so to speak. Okay, so what is the fruit? It is knowledge of good and evil. What is that? That's wisdom. What is wisdom really about? Being able to make judgments of right and wrong, good and bad, in circumstances in which you don't have a simple rule to follow. Things like thou shalt not kill are very clear. Well, I mean, I would actually make a caveat. Thou shalt not murder, because murder is by definition unjust killing. But there may be an instance where somebody kills someone else and it's not necessarily unjust, right? Like in self-defense, some extreme incident of self-defense. So the problem with the rules of morality is that they don't always explain how they should be applied in the real world, right? Like someone could tell you never lie, but I could come back and give you 1,000 examples in which it actually might be the moral thing to do to lie to somebody under a certain circumstance, right? Like Kant gives a famous one where a murderer who you know is a murderer comes to your house asking for your friend, and basically you know that the murderer wants to kill your friend. Do you give the murderer your friend's name? Like, duh, that's a no-brainer, right? You lie to them, right? Because that's what the murderer deserves. They deserve a lie for, given their intention. Okay. So what is wisdom? It's really knowledge about how to live, because our goal is human happiness. And how do we want to live? We want to be happy. The question is, do we have the ability to judge right and wrong in particular circumstances of our lives in order to do the right thing, whatever that thing may be, in order to be happy, right? And it seems that the Bible places the central focus in terms of our yearning for knowledge and our curiosity about knowledge is centered around this practical knowledge of right and wrong, which is wisdom. And that this is the wisdom and issues of right and wrong are the central concern for our own happiness, right? And what's interesting is we're going to see in Prometheus a slightly different understanding of what type of knowledge matters most for a human being. And even in Milton, he takes some interesting liberties with the temptation story. And really, I would argue, maybe modifies it in a certain way to give it a slightly expanded understanding, particularly of what the meaning of this fruit is. Because here it's obvious, the fruit is wisdom. It's knowledge of good and evil, because we need to know about good and evil in order to do the right thing, in order to be what? In order to be what? What does every human being desire? However imperfectly.
To be wise.
Pardon?
To be wise.
No, nobody wants to be wise.
To be happy.
Happy.
Yeah, they want to be happy. And the premise here is wisdom is like a means to happiness. That's why I'm being hard on you. People want to be happy in their conception of it. Okay. The fire. It represents some type of knowledge or even an ability, right? The fire is like literally a tool for survival, especially if you're thinking about like hunter and gatherer societies and like the first moment in history when mankind tamed fire and was able to use it for all different types of things. Somebody other than Angelica for a moment. And credit to Angelica for being on top of things and having some great responses. What do we think the fire represents?
Progress, hope.
Okay, absolutely. So both of these stories raise interesting questions about human progress, but also human decline. Think about the fall of Adam and Eve. By definition, it's a manifestation of a historical decline, which is to say a change for the worse. I think the fire is intimately connected with progress I think absolutely the story connects the fire as the underlying cause of human progress. But I don't think that's literally what the fire is supposed to represent. Progress is a product of what the fire is. What is the, what,
Hope.
because the fire is knowledge of some kind. Or
Is it more
ability of some kind.
Is it more intellectual knowledge and practical?
Okay, notice both of them are practical. And by practical, I just mean, and going back to Aristotle, practical knowledge is knowledge that can be applied for your own benefit in life, right? But they just apply in different ways because they're different types of knowledge. Any thoughts about what the fire is or what it represents?
Hope.
I would say that's part of the progress part. And that's a consequence. I don't disagree with you, but I think that's like a meaning that is based on, it's a derivative meaning of the more fundamental thing of what the fire is. What does the fire allow mankind to do in the story? I mean, we'll look at it momentarily, but
They were able to create tools and
stop. So what do you call it? The knowledge or ability to create tools. So notice this is not moral knowledge of good and evil, right? The fire definitely doesn't represent that in any obvious way.
Is it to survive?
Yes, and not just survive, but to survive comfortably. But knowledge of what? Knowledge of tools, knowledge of ability to make things, to make one's life better. What kind of knowledge would you call that? It's not moral knowledge.
Power?
It's connected with power. Absolutely, because this knowledge gives them the power to have control over their environment and their lives in a way they didn't before.
Intellectual.
I would say no. I mean, typically when you use the word like intellectual knowledge, you're actually at least in just the history of it, you're referring to knowledge that you want to know for its own sake, but not for the sake of like applying for practical benefit. What is knowledge of how to make tools and things like that? What do you call that? I think someone who said that is probably, they're the closest to what this fire really is.
like science.
Yeah. What's the other thing that goes with science?
Math.
Too abstract. When you have science, you apply science in a practical way and you get what as a result. In our world, look, the story of the fire is also a story about our world too. You guys know this better than the people who wrote this story because you live with the products of this type of knowledge in a way that the Greeks who wrote this story never did.
Resourcefulness.
It absolutely is connected with our resourcefulness, and that resourcefulness is a product of this type of knowledge. There's two things you can do with science. You can use science to simply understand the world, and you can also use the science to do what?
Deliver.
Self-knowledge?
Actually, no. I would say the moral knowledge is much, the fruit is much closer to issues of self-knowledge than technical, I didn't say it, than the knowledge that comes with the fire. In fact, this is a fairly impersonal knowledge. And the people who get involved in these kind of things actually tend to be more impersonal. What is the thing that, what is our fire?
Technology.
What is our
technology?
Yes. Technological knowledge. The knowledge of how to do X. The knowledge of how to build. In ancient Greek, there's a word called I've got it down here. So we've got the difference here in these two. I put it down here between the fruit representing wisdom, knowledge of good and evil on one hand, and the fire representing technical knowledge. And the Greek word for it is techne. And techne is where we get our word technology. And it can be translated as an art or a craft, not as in like fine arts, but as in like the making of something, right? Like the art of blacksmithing, the art of shoemaking. These are examples that you see, like, for example, in Greek philosophy, right? Techne is technical knowledge about how to make something. And the result of the knowledge is not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. It is the production of a tool. It results in the production of a tool that makes your life better or worse.
Better.
Yeah, hopefully better. But that remember with Prometheus also came Pandora and everything that was in her box. Okay. This gets into, well, I want to speed this up a little bit, but this gets into a really interesting discussion of progress versus decline. When you look at the story of the fall, by definition, the very name that theologians and church fathers and rabbis have given this story, the fall, right? It manifestly implies a decline. And when you look at the story, they move from the Garden of Eden to the real world. And that's obviously a certain type of decline. But of course, there are also interesting types of trade-offs that they do get things for having given up this kind of state of perfection, because we discover that in the Garden of Eden, the state of perfection is not really human. They're not really fully human. They're either like children who are ignorant, or they're like kind of pre-civilized animals who are not in the full use of their faculties. And because we have speech and reason, we have this thing called logos, speech and reason. We live a rational existence. We live a life of thinking and choosing and attempting to decide between right and wrong as we take our actions. And of course, that is a fully human life that's only manifest once they pick the fruit. However, in the story of Prometheus, it's obviously a story of progress, right? Things get better for mankind as a result of Prometheus bringing the fire. There's no doubt about it, right? And it presents an image not just of a momentary progress, but really of a broad historical progress over epochs of time, right? So progress and decline have to do with like the big sweep of history. The stock market, it's like a sine curve. It goes up and it gets down and up and down and up and down and all that stuff, right? Oil prices go up and down and up and down, right? So history does the same thing. And here we have one model of decline going down on the sine curve and one kind of going up at a constant rate. It's more like it's less like a sine curve, and it's more like a straight line at an angle, getting better and better gradually and gradually off into the future. What exactly is progress? In a nutshell,
Like
Angelica.
evolution.
Well, I would say evolution could be considered a form of progress. So that would be like an example. What is progress?
It's like making things better. So
Well,
not
let's keep it really simple. Life gets better in some dimension, some facet. Simple as that. So remember Barack Obama? Let me think. It's 2022. You guys are in college. Can I ask you if you remember Barack Obama talking about hope and change? Does everybody remember Barack Obama with hope and change?
yes.
Okay, who could forget that? Did he really mean change? I'm going to argue no. What he really meant was progress, because there's change for the better and there's change for the worse, and both are equally possible. And only one of them is desirable. Obviously, we want change for the better, and change for the better is called progress. So when he said hope and change, what he really meant hope for progress in the future on all the different dimensions of American life that he talked about. Okay, here's the $24,000 question. Number one, the fruit represents moral knowledge. Has mankind made progress in morality in the course of human civilization at large? Has the world become a more moral, righteous, and just place as we go forward from the ancient world to 2022?
Yes.
Yes, in what ways?
When it comes to like crime rate, it's less barbaric, I should
The
say.
crime rate. You
It's
mean in
less
Chicago, Baltimore, and New York? and San Francisco?
It's less barbaric.
Like, because there's no war anymore?
Oh, please.
All right, what about, so one of the things that modern man, meaning human beings, likes to pat ourselves on the back for is that slavery has been brought to an end. I don't think there's there's definitely no regime on the planet in which they openly acknowledge slavery as legal or just. And of course, the Confederacy, to mention one of an array of examples of, societies, political regimes, the Confederacy openly acknowledged slavery as not only acceptable, but just and appropriate, because their premise was that human beings were not equal, contrary to the Declaration of Independence, and that therefore they should be politically recognized as some people are masters or some people are slaves. Some people, so slavery. Does there exist slavery on the planet today anywhere?
Of course.
Of
Yeah.
course. Okay, fair enough. You want to give me examples?
Well, I can't give you an example, but you said that last week.
Some might say the Uyghurs in China.
No.
Might some say, or might most of us say, if we looked at it carefully?
Most.
Yeah, I mean, have I looked into every last detail of the Uyghurs? That's a good example. No, but my impression is basically they're enslaved and not free under the Chinese regime, basically because they're the wrong kind of ethnic minority within China, and they practice the wrong religion, and they are deemed a threat by the Chinese communist totalitarian government. So the Uyghurs are a good example. Do we want to find any, do we have, so this is tricky. This is an empirical question. And the thing about the modern world today is nobody publicly really admits that slavery exists today. And when it does, they don't call it slavery normally. Any other examples of slavery in the modern world, like right here, right now? Angelica.
Well, it's not like slavery as far as like they don't, well, yeah, it kind of is. All the sweatshops where like things get made, like the shoes, the clothes, and all of those, technically, like by definition, that could technically be slavery.
Yeah, sure. So that's a good example. And we can talk about slavery as a matter of degree. Like those, what is a slave? You know what Lincoln said? A slave is when you work and I eat the bread. You grow the wheat and I eat the bread from it, without paying you for your labor, right? Remember Adam, from the sweat of his brow, he will eat bread. It's amazing. The Bible does not accept, well, the Bible on slavery is a tricky one, but at least in this story, it's a repudiation of slavery because yes, Adam has to work for his bacon, right, to pay the bills, but he gets to keep the fruits of his own labors, right? It didn't say like, from the sweat of Eve's brow, Adam will eat bread, right? That's slavery. Yeah, so the Chinese who are in the big Foxconn factories in England, in China, they are very close to slaves, and basically they're forced to work in conditions that would never be acceptable in 90% of the countries around the world. And it's tricky because those people have come there because they can make money there that they can't make in their village, but then they're like forced by necessity to do what they're doing. So they're kind of caught in what they're doing. So that's a good example. Any other examples of slavery? Because we all said that we've made all this progress.
Is
as
like
modern
sex
humans.
trafficking
Pardon?
considered slavery? Sex trafficking?
Yeah, thank you. It's actually something that Donald Trump brought to the attention of the American public, if people were listening, because he actually gave many, many talks about sex trafficking, including the sex trafficking of children, which is, it's kind of like in another league beyond prostitution, because these people are literally enslaved and sold to people. I've done a little kind of casual research on that. And I mean, I think Trump might have even said that there are more people in slavery today because of the total population of the planet than had ever been the case in human history. And of course, the part of the problem is the slavery is invisible. And of course, people would like to keep it that way. Anyone know what some of the biggest countries are for partaking of sex slaves? I mean, like real sex slaves, people who are bought and sold to be sexual objects.
Wasn't Epstein doing this here in the States?
Yeah, he's part of it. Absolutely.
And
Until he didn't kill himself, sure.
And wasn't France or England included?
Probably. I don't know details about them. Any knowledge of what country is one of the worst partakers of it in the world?
I think India.
Could be. I'm thinking closer to home. The United States has one of the biggest issues, for a modern so-called Western nation and all this stuff with sex trafficking. And you can actually look state by state. You can get a lot of information on this, and you will see that Florida, Maryland area, because there's a port there, New York, really bad for sex trafficking. The media doesn't talk about it for some reason, despite the fact that they claim to like to speak truth to power and all that bullshit. Okay, so let's just say there's some deep ambiguities about our claims to moral superiority compared to the ancients. Actually, there's something, at least the ancient people were honest about what they did, whereas we pretend we're better, but we do the same things anyway. Now, here's the easy question. Has mankind made technological progress since the Stone Ages?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this one's like a no-brainer. And we're sitting here on computers right now. So that's kind of like, the computer and the computer processor and all that, like this is the thing that's redefined the life of humanity across the globe. Technology is basically tools and the knowledge to make them. Are tools good or bad?
Depends how you use them.
Awesome answer. A tool in the right person's hand, I don't know, saves a life on a operating table, or it kills someone, right? The same scalpel. what do you need with the tool? You need the knowledge of how to use it, not just technically, but what's the right way to use it? Am I using it the right way or the wrong way? So, so I don't want to say any more about that. What kind of knowledge is more important? Moral knowledge or technological knowledge for human happiness, right? This is all about our desire to thrive and be happy and be contented with our lives.
I think moral. Wouldn't it be like, I mean, if we
Okay,
didn't have technology, we wouldn't know what it was like to be in this world, right? If I make sense. Like back then, they didn't have what we have now, but they still managed to get by.
how did they survive without air conditioning on a hot, humid summer day and a hot August day in New York? With the
I don't know. They would stand each other.
so who said moral knowledge? Is that Natalie?
Yeah, it's me.
Okay, what do other people think? Which knowledge matters more for human happiness?
I think moral is more important.
Okay, there's another for moral. Anastasia, what else? What other opinions? Anyone want to argue that technological knowledge is more important?
No.
Okay, not
Well,
really. So
Yeah.
what's the simple answer as to why moral knowledge you think is more important?
Because like people get satisfied when they are like good through moral knowledge more than technological.
Which people are those?
The mankind, I
And
don't know.
if I go and work a job and I make good money, I've got my air conditioning, I've got my Bluetooth smart technology, I've got my flat screen TV, I've got a nice meal, I've got a nice car. Boy, that sounds nice to me. Anastasia?
Well, the moral is initial, and by having technology knowledges, we will know how to apply them in the right way by having moral knowledges.
Okay, so there's the argument. That's perfect. So think about the technological knowledge. It allows us, it tells us how to live more comfortably, right? Obviously, advances in science and technology eliminate all types of challenges and all types of suffering that historically most people had to deal with, you know? Like, let's just take infant mortality. The number of children that died in childbirth because of technology prior to the 20th century is kind of astronomical and must have been just psychologically devastating for people. And if you read biographies of people from the 19th century prior, you know, they had to produce a lot of kids because a lot of them would die young, many in infancy shortly after birth, right? And that was just a fact of life. That's incredibly brutal. Today, you know, under most circumstances, I don't know what the number is, but you know, infant mortality because of our technology and so on, and the care we can provide if a kid's premature or something is just, you know, it's like magic compared to prior to the 20th century. But it's knowledge of how to live more comfortably. And the question we really want is, what is the right thing to do? Because really it's the doing the right thing with the technology that's going to give us happiness. Okay, good. What's interesting is the biblical tradition, the tradition of Jerusalem, so to speak, focuses on this issue of moral knowledge as the path to happiness. Whereas the Prometheus story, it doesn't lack a concern for morality, because one of the consequences of this story is that what Prometheus does unleashes Pandora's box, which creates all these problems. So it raises this deep question of whether technical knowledge is the end all and be all. But at least the section of this story we're reading presents technical knowledge really as the dominant type that's going to make our lives better, aka make us happy. Okay. You know, we've kind of talked about Prometheus. There may be we're getting tight on time here. There may be a couple things I want to reference toward the end, but before we call it a night. But right now, I want to turn to Milton, and I just want to talk about a few things very quickly, and then jump to that reading and talk about it for the rest of the class. Right? So the snake, he is the primary speaker in this passage from Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a reference to the fall, right? And the snake here really takes center stage, and it could appear like Milton is really celebrating what the snake says and kind of taking his point of view, but I'm kind of excerpting this one little speech from the context of the whole book. So to see it in context, it reads a little bit differently, but he does give the serpent a lot of really interesting and powerful things to say that sound really convincing. So remember that he's a creepy, crawly animal on earth. Why does that matter? Because when God creates everything, there's this hierarchical order, and the snake is the one that's literally closer to the earth, beneath the human being. The human being is standing up. Our heads kind of ascend up more to heaven. We have that divine spark in us from the breath of life. And we have this special status that's been conferred on us by God that apparently the other animals don't have. And for some totally bizarre reason, this serpent has been given human qualities, and to say he has human qualities is almost to say he has God-like qualities, right? So it's weird that this creature on the ground, who's a brute or a beast, acts like a human being and talks like one too. So what is he? He's subtle, he's cunning, he's beguiling, and with the beguilement, he tempts Eve. He's very often connected with Satan, although that word is not used here. And the word Satan is actually not, originally it was not a proper noun, as in Satan with a capital S, but it was normally the or a Satan. And a Satan was a tempter figure, someone who tempted someone to do the wrong thing, is something we're going to see in the story of Job. One way to think of him is literally the voice of reason. And you have to remember what the Bible says about reason. The Bible clearly admires our powers of reasoning because it spends so much time addressing them. On the other hand, it acknowledges that reason alone is not the proper guide to life. And our ability to reason makes us arrogant to think that we can just use our reason and solve the problems of our life. But the Bible clearly indicates that it's faith and fear in the Lord that is kind of the true guide to human life. And that claim is like what divides people who believe versus people who don't. If you're an atheist, you're going to probably believe that your own reason is what should guide you. So the snake is a rhetorician, right? And in this speech, he engages in the art of public speaking and the art of persuasion, right? One key element about rhetoric or public speaking. What is public speaking? It's what politicians do, right? The snake is a kind of a politician here speaking to his captive audience. Question: what do politicians tell the people when they come out and make a political speech, like on a campaign trail?
We tell them lies.
But very good. They tell them lies. If you think that politics is about the truth, you got to go back to school. Politics is about lies. Yes, and what are the lies? They're promises. And I would say the same of the war in Ukraine. I don't claim to know exactly what's going on, but I can tell you, there's a famous expression that in war, the first casualty is truth. And there's a reason for that, because actually I have it right here. I just happen to have it. So this is Sun Tzu's Art of War. It's a very famous book on kind of military strategy. But what's interesting, it has all kinds of strategies that are not just, about, killing people on a battlefield or something like that. It's much more psychological. And every famous writer on war has acknowledged that deception and lies is like one of the most essential elements to fighting a war, right? And they call things, the war, they describe it like there's the fog of war and whatnot, like you don't really know what's going on. And part of that is because not only do people not want to tell you what's really going on, because that's going to disadvantage their side, but they want to promote disinformation or misinformation or lies about what is going on to gain a strategic advantage. And it's obvious that our media is engaged in a massive kind of propaganda campaign surrounding this war right now. And I'm not saying that one side is right and one side is wrong. I don't even want to get into that stuff. But I find it very interesting most nights when I watch for a few minutes that they tell you all this stuff and then they give you no evidence to demonstrate that what they're saying has any basis in fact, other than the fact that they said it. So they're engaging in, public persuasion as well. So when politicians go on the campaign trail, and the snake is on the campaign trail here, they tell you lies, they make you promises, and the basic thing that's connected with these two, they tell you what you want to hear, right? I'll give you a great example. Like when Hillary Clinton ran for the first time in 2008, when she went to the South, like a Southern Baptist Black church, all of a sudden she developed a Southern drawl, right? And then when she went to the North, I don't know, to speak in, say, New York or something like that, she spoke the way she normally spoke, right? And what politicians do is they tailor their message to their audience, particularly, presidential candidates. They go around the country and they have to tailor their message to that, the constituency of that state and their specific issues and their little cultural nuances and stuff like that. You have to know your audience. And let's just say the serpent knows his audience. Okay. The goal of rhetoric is to get the person who's listening to shift their opinion to the point of view you want them to have, to reach the conclusion you want them to reach. There's three main ways to do that. And they're called logos, pathos, appealing to logos, pathos, or ethos, right? Logos has to do with appealing to the head, using reason, logic, and evidence. And we would say that's a kind of scientific argument, right? So if you tell someone, the COVID vaccine works really well, and you go, that's because this evidence demonstrates that it's 95% effective in protecting you from COVID or something like that. And you've got the data, right? Evidence. Pathos is an appeal to the emotions. And when you think of politicians, and particularly when I watch this stuff about the war, they constantly appeal to people's emotions without facts. What they want to do is inflame your biases, inflame your natural prejudices. So they come out and say today, like a baby died or something like that. And it inflames your sense of indignation and may even make you blind to really assessing those facts correctly, because you're so emotional about, because it's an instinctual thing. So appealing to the heart. And then the last one, ethos, is an appeal based on authority or the character of the speaker, right? So ethos has to do with like a testimonial, like I'm a person of good character and therefore you should trust me, right? So the perfect example of this is Anthony Fauci, who literally said that if you do not believe everything he says, you do not believe in science. He basically said, I am the science. Of course, that's not, science is not based on a personal authority. It's actually not based on ethos. It's based on impersonal facts that you can demonstrate to someone else. So he was actually mixing logos and ethos together. Logos is really scientific argumentation, but ethos is believe me because I'm a credible person, right? And the media spent 2 years building up the credibility of Anthony Fauci, despite the fact he said many things that totally contradicted themselves, right? And other things. Question. Which one of these strategies does the snake use to convince Eve to pick of the fruit? 1, 2, or 3. Appeal to the head, appeal to the heart, or appeal as an authority character, authority figure.
It should be pathos.
Pathos, absolutely. And can you explain why?
I mean, the desire part, I think, is a big.
Okay.
big part.
What desire does he play on with Eve? What desire does he play
The
on?
desire of to be independent, to have her own decisions and stuff.
Okay, good. The things that Bakunin referenced: desire to make own choice, desire to be independent, desire to be free of God's tyranny, desire to be what? What other desire is lurking there? There's a couple other desires. So pathos is emotion and desire is an emotion, right? What other desires does Eve have that the
To be
snake is going to
knowledgeable.
exploit?
To be
To be
knowledgeable.
like God.
Yes, she is ambitious, right? This is an ambitious woman. She wants to be like God. That's ambition. She wants to climb higher than her station, her lot, her rank. What other desire does she have? There's one more big one. She desires the fruit, right? The fruit is a metaphor. Metaphor for what? What does she desire?
To have
Is it
knowledge
power?
of good and evil.
Yeah, she
Power?
desires knowledge, right? And that's just another way of saying she's curious, right? Aristotle says that because we are the rational animal and have the power to know and understand, we naturally have the desire to know. We have natural curiosity, right? So she desires knowledge because she's curious. She desires power because she's ambitious. She wants to be godlike as a form of power. She desires to be independent. So we could kind of ring that up under being godlike, all those, rebellious, all those kind of things. Okay, pathos, I think, is the most obvious one. Does the snake employ the other two, logos and ethos, in Milton's speech that he gives the snake?
He uses ethos also because he
Okay,
tried to say I ate
yeah.
it and I didn't die.
So yes, he absolutely uses ethos. And how is that? Can you say it again?
He said that he ate the fruit and he did not die. So
Okay,
yeah.
so where does his authority as a speaker come from then?
The fruit.
Wisdom?
What?
It could be. Well, where does his authority come from? What has he done? What does he claim to have done?
He ate the fruit.
Yeah, it's that simple. His authority comes from the fact that he's done it himself, and he's simply telling her that he's done it. It's like a testimonial in a commercial. Does anyone know what a testimonial is?
Yeah.
What's that?
Basically expressing experience in something. Like someone who probably went to a doctor and got cured, so they will come on and say, I got treated for X, Y, and Z and it worked, and like I'm a living proof that
Yeah, there you go. Living proof, right? I did the Jenny Craig weight loss program. I got to eat whatever I want, and I lost 50 pounds in the process, and you can too. And why do you believe that you can too? Because you see them, and they're not selling you Jenny Craig directly. There's someone who used it, and they're like in your position, right? And you can relate to them. They're not the car dealer themselves. They're one of the people who bought one of the cars. Of course, they're getting like paid behind the back from the car dealer to say these things, right? Or they're not real customers to begin with. They're paid actors and stuff like that. So it's all make believe. Yeah, good. So ethos is a kind of personal testimony in this case, where the snake claims to have done it and he can speak from a position of authority because he's done it. What about logos? Does he use logos? Does he make rational arguments for why she should pick the fruit?
Yeah.
He sure does. Absolutely. And one of the things that's so amazing about his arguments is they're so logically consistent. Doesn't necessarily mean they're true because there's some presumptions that he makes. But can anyone give an example of a logic? And this is probably the hardest one, and we'll read it. Can anyone give an example of a logical argument he makes as to why she should eat the fruit? Angelica.
So it's based on like facts. So he says kind of like, aren't there like so many trees here? Didn't he tell you like you could eat from all the trees? So it kind of like the snake describes all the facts that, you know, it's like a question, but it's also like a fact. So that was one of the big ones for me. Like he was like, didn't God create all of this? And it's true, like God did create all of those trees.
Good, good. So let's look now. We should just, let me go. Oh, we'll skip that. Let's go to the text and just get one thing in mind. So I've drawn a little line here, which is this is the kind of frame, the kind of rhetorical frame of the text. So at the outset, the narrator, let's just say it's Milton, the narrator says, the tempter, all impassioned, thus began. What did he begin? He began his speech to Eve, right? And the tempter is whom?
The snake.
Yeah, the snake, the serpent. But it's interesting, instead of using the serpent, he uses the word snake. So they're essentially synonyms. And the other interesting thing is that the word Satan, the original meaning is simply a tempter, one who tempts somebody into doing bad things, basically, right? And so here Milton is explicitly associating the serpent with Satan, despite the fact that in the original story, that association is not quite made, but it's understandable why it's made historically, right? Okay, he gives his speech, blah, 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 blah. Then we get down to this line. This is the outside frame of the speech. He ended his speech. His words replete with guile. I have a funny question. While the snake is giving this speech, what is Eve doing the whole time? What is Eve doing while the serpent is giving the speech? In some ways, it's a pretty simple answer, but there's one little addition to it that's important.
Listening him?
I'm sorry?
Listening him?
Yes, listening to him. Listening, right? For 1,000, Jeopardy. What is she doing beside listening? There's one other thing she's doing.
She's thinking.
Yes, she is thinking, and she's also experiencing all these feelings and desires. So there's all types of psychological machinations going on, but there's still one other thing she's doing. I'm not saying she's running a marathon. She's still just standing there, but she's doing something as she stands beside thinking and listening.
She's deciding on what to do.
That's all the thinking stuff. Let me read this. He ended. His words replete with guile, right? Sneaky, guile, sneaky, cunning, subtle, right? Into her heart to easily entrance one. That's pathos, right? He appealed to her heart and her head, right? But the two are not perfectly separate. when Plato and Aristotle, for example, say that we have a desire for knowledge, that is an emotional desire, despite the fact that we use our heads to gain the information, it's still an impulse. It's we have a kind of, I don't know, a non-rational desire for, understanding. So into her heart too easily won, fixed on the fruit she gauged, which to behold might tempt alone, and in her ears the sound yet rung of his persuasive words, imprained with reason, to her seeming and with truth. Meanwhile, let's stop right there. Let's stop right there. Oh, let's keep going. Meanwhile, the hour of noon drew on, and waked an eager appetite raised by the smell so savory of that fruit, which with desire inclinable now grow to touch or taste, solicited her longing eye. Yet first, pausing a while, thus to herself she mused, and then she gives a speech. What is she doing while she's listening to the snake?
Staring at the fruit.
Yes, she's not just staring. She's what else?
She's
Gazing.
becoming tempted.
What?
She's becoming
Senses.
tempted.
Yes, she is being tempted. She sees it, but what else?
Smells it.
He's admiring it.
She sees it, it looks good. She smells it, it smells good. She's imagining touching it and tasting it, but she hasn't quite done that yet. Question. There's two things going on here simultaneously that are parallel and interconnected. On the one hand, she's apparently having a physical experience, an empirical experience with the fruit, like the sensual pleasures it has, by pleasures of the senses, not sexual pleasure, pleasures of the senses. On the other hand, she's hearing all these words from the snake. Is there a fundamental difference between the words she's hearing and that fruit that she's looking at and smelling? Somebody beside Ariba. Is there a fundamental difference between all those words that are pouring in her ear and the fruit and its sensual properties?
Is she getting tempted?
Well, of course, absolutely. She's getting tempted by the words and she's getting tempted by the physical properties of the fruit. My question is there really a difference between the two?
I don't think so.
Yeah. The answer is no. What is this fruit really? This physical fruit is really what?
A metaphor, isn't it?
Yes. We got to make that clear. This fruit and its physical properties, its literal properties, are all really just metaphors for something that's figurative, right? The fruit really, look, the fruit of knowledge is not fruit for the tummy. It's not food for the tummy. It's food for what?
Your brain, your mind.
Yeah, for the mind,
heart.
or you might even say the soul, because that includes like mind and heart and mind, right? So this is an immaterial fruit. Knowledge is an immaterial fruit. And the whole story, I mean, it's the biblical story, but Milton really grasps onto this in a very powerful way, evocative way. He really shows you how the physical desire for this enjoyable object that you would want to eat and the hunger, the bodily hunger associated with it, is really all just a metaphor for the desire for this knowledge, right? So we're not really talking about a literal fruit at all. Milton and the original story are using this literal object to help evoke something that's metaphorical and something that's invisible rather than tactile or tangible. Okay, so that's really important. So, you know, what's interesting is that all her senses are being, you could say, assaulted here. She's got words coming into her ears, being poured into her ears, right? And then she's got the visual aspect, and then there's the aspect of smell. And then the other two senses, she wants to touch it and she wants to taste it. Okay. So in the time remaining, I'd like to read now what the serpent actually says. And I want to have an eye. So look back. This passage right here really lets you know quite clearly what rhetorical strategies the snake is using. Emotional to the heart. And then there are things about reason and truth. His words are impregned with reason. All right, this great 17th century language from Milton. What does it mean that the snake's words are, quote, impregned with reason? What the heck does that word impregned mean? Did anyone look it up?
No, but does it mean like, you know, his words make sense? They're
I don't
logical?
disagree with you. I don't disagree with you, but it's a little more specific than that. We have to know what the word impregned means, and I'll tell everybody if nobody has any clue. What does it look? What does that word look like, kind of?
Entrapped?
No. Impregnated. His words were impregnated with reason, meaning, you know, they're another metaphor. They're redolent of reason. They're rational. His words make, as you said, his words make sense, right? I mean, that's not a bad explanation, but his words sounded very reasonable. Now, of course, when somebody tells you what you want to hear, you have what's called confirmation bias, which is, since they're telling you what you want to hear, you believe it's true. You confirm it as true because it's what you want to hear. And one thing we often do when we hear what we want to hear is we think that what's being said is rational and reasonable. Of course, I think we can all agree that, independent of that issue, that the snake is very rational, which makes us call into question the value of reason a little bit, because he may be asking us to do in a very rational way something that's not good for us, right? Okay, who would like to read, starting from O sacred, wise, and wisdom giving plant? Could I have a volunteer read for us?
Not read.
Who's that?
Natalie.
Natalie, go for it. Thank you.
O sacred, wise, and wisdom giving plant, mother of science, now I feel thy power within me clear, not only to discern things and their causes, but to trace the ways of highest agents, deemed however wise, queen of this universe, do not believe those rigid threats of death. Ye shall not die. How should ye? By the fruit it gives you life. It gives you life to knowledge by the threatener. Look on me who have touched and tasted ye both. Live and life more perfect have attained than fate. Then to me, by venturing higher than my lot, shall that be shut to man, which to the beast is open, or will God incense his ire for such a petty trespass, and not praise rather your dauntless virtue, whom the pain of death denounced, whatever thing death be, deterred not from achieving what might lead to happier life. Knowledge of good and evil, of good how just, of evil, if what is evil, by real, what not known, since easier shunned.
Okay, one second.
God.
Let me make this a little bigger here. That helps. So he says, of good, how just, of evil, if what is evil be real, why not known, since easier shunned.
Okay, but all right, since easier shunned, God therefore cannot hurt ye and be just, not God, not feared then, nor obeyed. Your fear itself of death removes the fear. Why then was this forbid? Why but to awe? Why but to keep ye low and ignorant, his worshipper? He knows that in the day ye eat thereof, your eyes that seem so clear, yet are but dim, shall perfectly be then opened and cleared, and ye shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil as they know, that ye should be as gods. Since I, as man, internal man, is but proportion meet, I of brute human, yea of human gods, so ye shall die perhaps by putting off human to put on God's death to be wished. Thou threatened which no worse than this can bring, and what are gods that man may not become, as they participating God-like food? The gods are first, and that advantage use on our belief that all from them proceeds. I question it, for this fair earth I see, warmed by the sun, producing every kind, them nothing. If they all things who enclose knowledge of good and evil in this tree, that whatso eats thereof forthwith attains wisdom without their leave, and wherein lies the offense that man should thus attain to know. What can your knowledge hurt him, or this tree impart against his will, if all be his? Or is it envy? And can envy dwell in heavenly breasts? These and many more causes import your need of this fair fruit. God is humane. Reach then and freely taste. He ended. You want me to go? I'm sorry.
That's great right there. God is humane. Who is that?
Eve.
Eve, yes. Why does he call her God is humane?
He's giving her hopes.
Yeah, and he's telling her exactly what she wants to hear, right? And the whole idea here is to come back to the bottom of the first column, 710. The snake starts giving this testimonial. He says that ye should be as gods, since I as man. The snake is referring to himself as a human being. He says, I'm internal man. I mean, what does the Bible say about what really matters for the human being? It's not the physical form. What makes you a human being is the type of soul you have, a rational soul, a soul that has faith in God, so on and so forth. So the serpent obviously isn't going to look physically like a human being, but he is a human being in the sense that he has the defining capacities of a human being, which are speech and reason. How the hell he got him? I guess it's because he ate the fruit, right? He says, since I am man, internal man is but proportion meat. He says, I of brute human, ye of human gods. The snake describes himself as a brute human, and Eve can be a human god if she eats the fruit, right? What is a brute?
Someone who's like rough.
Yeah, so that's the kind of derivative meaning. Does anyone know the kind of more basic meaning, the fundamental meaning of the word brute? A brute is a what?
Is it someone who's like dumb or like less intelligent?
Yeah. That's still a kind of like the Geico man. That's still like if you guys know those old commercials, I guess they're old now. It's still more derivative. What is a brute? A brute is an. A brute is an animal. So when you call a human being a brute, you're really calling them an animal, and all the attributes that you describe go with that name. What is the serpent saying he is? I'm an animal human, right? What's the whole idea of the creation? The humans were made distinct. How is it that the serpent became an animal human? What did he do?
He ate the fruit
Yes, and what did that allow him to do?
to have knowledge like a human.
Yes, that's true. And I meant something specific. What did that allow him to do in terms of the order of creation?
To speak.
More generally, in terms of the structure of creation.
To think and analyze.
I'm thinking of something a little different. It's a product of what you're talking about. It allowed him to rise higher in the hierarchy of creation. He's just a snake that slithers on the ground, but now he's come closer to heaven because he's like a human being. The human being is already closer to heaven than the snake. So when they bite the fruit, they transcend he transcends the animal by becoming human. She is going to transcend the human by becoming a
God.
or godlike, or this mixture hybrid, right? So they move up closer to heaven. So hence God is humane, that mixes this concept up here again down here, just kind of in reverse order. That she transcends from being a mere human being to being a godlike human being, just as he is elevated. He describes his lot. Now, a lot is like your place in the order of society. It's like the God-given. You have to understand that the Bible describes a fixed hierarchy of the cosmos in which each being in that great chain of being has its place. What is the fruit allowed the serpent to do to rise higher than his original place was dictated when the creation was, conceived. Question. How does Milton conceive of the fruit in terms of what kind of knowledge is it? What kind of knowledge is stressed here? Is it moral knowledge, or is it other type of knowledge, scientific or technological knowledge?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So in the original story, in chapter 2 of the Bible, chapter 3, it's clearly focusing on moral knowledge. In Prometheus, the fire seems to primarily focus on technological knowledge. Does this story focus on moral knowledge or more scientific technical knowledge in terms of giving meaning to the fruit as a symbol of some type of knowledge?
I would say scientifical, correct?
No comment. What do other people think?
I think moral.
What do other people? We got a disagreement. Good. What do other people think? Is it moral knowledge or is it scientific knowledge?
Scientific.
Another one says scientific. In the interest of time, let's say it's both, right? If you look to these passages down here, he talks about how, why wouldn't you want to know good and evil? If you know what good is, then you can do it. And if you know what evil is, you can avoid it. But if you're in ignorance about both of them, when you act, you don't know what you're doing, right? However, when we look at passages like here or passages here, let's just read this. Let's just read this. O sacred, wise, and wisdom-giving plant. Now, wisdom by definition is knowledge of good and evil in the biblical context. Mother of science. Mother of science. The thing that gives birth to science. That's what a mother does in this context. Another way of thinking in a less anthropomorphic way, the cause of science. Now I feel thy power. Now, wait a second. The fruit gives mankind power. The fruit, the knowledge of the fruit gives mankind power. Does everyone know I think did we talk about it? Knowledge is power.
Yes, we did.
Okay,
we
so I mean, I suppose this is a trope going back to the ancient world, but in the 17th century, Francis Bacon, who was one of the founders of the scientific revolution, very famously and boldly asserted knowledge is power, right? And what he really meant was scientific knowledge of the natural world, the physical world, is power, because when you understand the physical world, you can then, and its laws of cause and effect, you can then leverage those laws to for power for your own ends, right? And if you think about science, understands the laws of nature, and understanding those laws of nature allows us to develop technologies that control those laws or manipulate those laws in a certain way and give us power over ourselves, over the world, over the nature. And I mean, the goal of the scientific revolution was actually the conquest of nature for the relief of man's estate, which means essentially controlling the natural world in order to make our lives better as human beings. And how do you control it? You can only control it through knowledge, because knowledge is power. Okay, so there's some really interesting things here. Let's go just 2 minutes if we could. Let's read this. I want to come back and finish with this mother of science and what that means, because we haven't answered that. But let's just come here. This section here, it's really close to the biblical description of the fruit representing knowledge of good and evil. But these two instances at the beginning and then here at 7:17 focus on, I think, scientific knowledge. And that's why we have this disagreement here. Maybe it's not a disagreement. Maybe it's just both and. The gods are first, and that advantage use on our belief that all from them proceeds. Now, this is interesting that gods is in plural here. That's very strange, because in the Bible, there is one God. But it calls into question, it's part of the serpent's sales pitch that if you eat the fruit, you'll become like God. And I suppose that would mean there would be gods plural. The gods are first. What does that mean? They're first in the hierarchy. They're at the top of the hierarchy of the cosmos, at the pinnacle of the pyramid. They're the most powerful, so on and so forth. And that advantage they use this on our belief. They try to compel us to believe that they're the most powerful beings. They try to encourage us to believe that all from them proceeds. Now, that's an awkward formulation. The gods try to get us to believe that everything proceeds from them. Let me put it another way. The gods try to get us to believe that they are the cause of everything. What kind of people believe that God is the cause of everything? Someone who what?
Religious?
Yeah, someone who has faith. Very simple. If you're in the scientific perspective, what is the cause of everything? What causes things? In the biggest, most general sense. There's a word for it that the Greeks came up with. It starts with an N. If you're a scientist and you look into the cause of things, you don't look in heaven. Where do you look?
Hell.
Nah, because they don't believe in that either.
Theories?
You might develop theories about it, but where do you look to confirm your theories?
On evidence.
Evidence of what? What's the big thing that you look for evidence from? The all-encompassing term. All right, we want to get going. Ariba's got it, nature. So what does he say here? The gods want you to believe that they are the cause of everything. And what does he say? I question it. What is the thing that makes you question it? It's your reason, right? Because what does reason do? It questions things. He says, for this fair earth I see, warmed, let me put it this way, warmed not by the gods, but by the sun. That's the evidence you see with your eyeballs. And the evidence is physical, empirical, sensual evidence of nature. In this case, the sun, producing every kind, them nothing. Let's just leave it at this. He says, the religious stories and the gods try to convince you that they are the cause of everything. But when I use my reason and I approach things scientifically, what do I see? I don't see God producing anything. I see the sun produce. Does the sun produce everything on the planet?
I mean, it helps.
Would there be life on the planet? From a scientific perspective, would there be life on the planet without the sun? And where it is?
No.
Definitely not. So is this a scientific conclusion that the sun is the cause of all life on the planet?
Yeah.
Yeah, in a general sense, absolutely, right? It produces the plants, and then the single-celled organisms, and the organisms eat the plants, and then bigger organisms eat the smaller ones who eat the plants, and all that stuff. And what does he say that he sees that the gods produce? They don't produce anything. Okay. So here's the argument, that the fruit provides not just moral knowledge, but also scientific knowledge that could give one power over the world. And I'll just leave with this. It's interesting when Milton writes this, Europe, and particularly England, are already well advanced into the stages of the scientific revolution. Galileo had already come 100 years before, and Descartes and Francis Bacon are the two main figures that are developing the modern logic behind the scientific revolution, right? That basically we would understand the world no longer through the book and through the word. In the beginning was the word, and the word was God, right? The scientific revolution said, if you want to understand the world, you do not look to a book. You do not look to the Bible. You look to, Ariba said it, you look to nature, and you analyze it with the method, the scientific method, in order to gain knowledge about it from empirical evidence. And then you take that knowledge, and if you use it the right way, it gives you power over the world to do things like create air conditioning and skyscrapers and all that cool stuff, right? Okay, so let's leave it right there. All righty. Thoughts, questions, comments before we go here, because we've gone over time. Thank you guys for hanging tight here. I'm sorry, go over, but we want to get through that.
I'm good, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have a bunch of emails to get to, so I will be getting to everybody's emails in the next day or two. All right, have a great night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Professor.
Good night.
Thank you.